Some of you may be more familiar with developer Shift Up's action RPG if I call it by its in-development title, Project Eve. That was this game's name when I first saw a trailer for it in 2021. The early footage showed our heroine Eve fighting a series of monsters in cinematic combat, and it was certainly enough to get your attention. Fast forward 3 years and this game is a PlayStation 5 exclusive by the name of Stellar Blade, that released on the 26th of April, 2024. Despite its star-referencing title, Stellar Blade's overarching goal seems to be grasping at a question that's a little closer to home. In fact, the key theme running through this adventure puts the focus firmly on questioning the concept of humanity. The opening cutscene shows the soldiers of Airborne Squadron 7 as they are dropped onto a dystopian future Earth, in a manner that even the Helldivers would find relatively reckless. Eve and her comrades are tasked with defeating the biological horror monsters that are the Naytiba, which are this game's primary antagonistic force. Very early on, Eve is saved from a powerful Naytiba by a man named Adam, and while the character naming is very on the nose, this sets the stage for a cooperative relationship that drives the early plot. Eve works to take down alpha Naytibas, while learning the truth about the events that led up to Earth becoming a dystopian nightmare. This delivery is assisted by a small group of primary cast members, whose stories help paint the backdrop of this world. The majority of these live in the hub city of Zion, and while Adam, Eve and Lily take centre stage, the design and behaviour of the other characters is generally more interesting. Orkul, Zion's leader, has a very unique character design, while bar singer Enya stars in one of the game's better chain side quests. As for our protagonist, you can say what you like about her character's physical appearance, but she serves the game well as this inexperienced blank slate who has ninja assassin level combat skills. Her knowledge of the world is very much from an academic textbook point of view, rather than from any real world experience.
Adam, what is this?
Don't you know this already? It's a map.
And contrasts Adam's apathetic, world-weary realism quite well.
Carrying on this way, that can only bring darkness.
Eve's naive attitude is sold by her very well-spoken and proper English accent that gives off the impression of a young noblewoman.
I can't just sit here and wait. In fact, I want to see the wasteland with my own eyes.
In general, the game's voice acting is good, but the writing does feel a bit staccato. The same feeling comes off in the story too, as while the general concept of the game is very interesting, it misses the mark with some of its reveals, and it didn't conceal the game's big twist well enough. Even the key act of Adam saving Eve is only told via flashback, when this really could have been a strong close to the opening boss battle. I did wonder if some elements of the story were lost in translation, or if additional scenes were cut last minute. There are times when Eve is very blunt and to the point, and others where she really labours to relate to emotions. It's difficult to pin down what her mood is at any one time. Meanwhile, Adam goes from exposition provider to cold realist, depending on the situation, and as a result, not a lot of natural chemistry develops between these two characters. This wasn't the detriment to the game that it could have been, and that's because the world building is very strong, and it really helped gloss over some of the other problems. It's clear from a visual standpoint that this world is harsh and unforgiving, and the use of graphic dismemberment scenes and references to death, sacrifice and hopelessness all help paint the picture. What really stands out in this regard are missions where you go underground into abandoned labs. These deprive Eve of her melee weapon, but leave her with access to the ranged drone. These sections play like an atmospheric horror game, and give off similar vibes to Resident Evil titles. These levels are mostly linear explorations, but rummaging through the notes and files left behind really builds a sense of tension. While the combat in this type of game usually carries the bulk of that load, it was impressive to see Stellar Blade shift some of that tension building process into their environmental design, particularly as the results here are very strong. From a purely gameplay perspective, I can find no better comparison than Star Wars Jedi Survivor. This is a very similar type of game, with Metroidvania-esque progression, skill trees, and even some visual similarities in combat, with a focus on movement, countering, and timing. In fairness to Stellar Blade, had I just based this off the demo, that's not the comparison I would have made. This is ultimately because the combat in the pre-release demo was slow and lethargic. This left me seriously considering whether I was getting the game or not. However, the game's day one patch reduced the input delay along with some important other components that I'll get to later. This change is what makes me confident when I say that combat feels good. Eve's swings and combos are more responsive. You no longer experience what feels like a huge delay between action and reaction on screen. This is only a moderate shift in timing, but has a noticeable impact on combat gameplay, and is why a game that originally felt slow and unresponsive, sort of like a very early Dark Souls game, is now more accurately likened to Respawn's latest Jedi adventure. In general, the flow of battle sees you mix regular slashing attacks with acrobatic combo attacks, while waiting for your enemies to attack you. There's a large component of gameplay that focuses on parrying and dodging to create openings, and every enemy has an additional meter under their health, which counts the number of times that you have perfect parried them. Once this has been drained, you get a powerful retribution attack, which sees Eve acrobatically slice and dice her opponent. Eve also has access to beta skills and later burst skills, which are designed to perform specific functions, like an AoE slash or to break enemy shields. These drain from resource bars that fill up by performing regular attacks, combo attacks, perfect dodges and parries. There is range combat in gameplay too, with your companion drone doubling up as a jack-of-all-trades damage dealer when needed, utilising a selection of ranged ammo to rain hell upon the Naytiba. Overall, Stellar Blade plays a lot like games that take elements from the usual Massacre playbook, and resting at camps causes enemies in the world to respawn. I do like the combat here. It's not groundbreakingly technical, and there is room for a bit more improvement with input delay and queuing, but there's enough in your character kit to feel like you always have an option, whether that be a consumable, an attack, a skill, or a chance to perfect parry. Traversal is an area where this game just feels loose. Eve behaves strangely sometimes when you are trying to platform. As an example of this, jumping between two robot drones is harder than it really should be, and the air dash distance is laughably poor. There are also some times where Eve won't grab onto ropes, or your momentum carries you further than it perhaps should. Traversal is overall passable, but strikes a harsh contrast to the improved combat, and it wouldn't surprise me if this was addressed at some point in the future. Progression in the game is mostly based on the skills that you have, with certain skills gated by story progress, and others by what the player chooses to unlock. Mostly these are augments for your base set of skills, while adding some powerful counter moves or passive improvements to damage. The skill tree isn't groundbreaking, but it's a solid part of progression, and is well complemented by upgrades to Eve's gear and combat arsenal. You can upgrade weapon damage and your drone while you're at camp, and these require materials found in the world from enemies or little robots. As you explore, you recover the cores from Eve's fallen compatriots, and these are used to improve health or beta gauges. You can also find useful drops like items or trade materials from enemies or chests in this world. The system works like a standard RPG, right down to upgrading different android parts on Eve herself to provide stats and bonuses like you would armor pieces or equipment. Combining the right sort of exospine with the right gears can make Eve a crit monster, or a parry tank, or even a really stealthy assassin. This truly becomes powerful once you unlock the ability to equip a second exospine and compare effects with each other. The system is fairly simple, but it gets the job done, and gives players just enough agency to make their own build decisions without creating a situation where Eve needed a handful of different weapons and combat stances to function. The result might truly be simple, but it works well. The enemy design is also solid too, with a good mix of weak minion-type enemies and more powerful units. These all attack in ways that make sense for their physiology, and there's a good difficulty curve from the early game to the mid-game. The bosses are the stars of the show, and although there's some repetition of these in side quests, it never felt like you fought one enemy over and over again. A quick aside on the bosses, the final 3 in the game are a noticeable uptick in difficulty. I mention this because I'm certain that the final 5 hours of my 25-hour first playthrough was spent dealing with these final 3 alone. I'm not showing footage of these fights as they're spoiler territory, and they're by no means unbeatable, but this was a difficulty spike that you really need to sit up and pay attention to. A large portion of my 12-hour hard mode run was spent getting past these same enemies. Moving from enemy design, I do want to talk general character design, because it's clearly something the game put a lot of focus on. Eve, the player character and protagonist, was clearly designed to target some sexualized ideal of a young Korean woman. Eve's body is based on the scan of a model in her 30s, while her face is an original creation. I mention this because throughout the game, I couldn't shake the thought that her face looked slightly too small and petite for her body. This could be a creative choice, but it was something that I noticed more and more as I played. The game's use of camera angles, cinematics, and the different costumes you can dress Eve in all feel like an added element of gratuitousness. But honestly, this is a game that came with a PEGI rating of 18, so I have no objection to this being a key component. It feels more transparent here in a game designed for adults, and while it's not something I particularly want or need from my games, I'd be very naive to think that Eve's physical appearance didn't entice hundreds, if not thousands of purchasers of this game that otherwise wouldn't have occurred. While I'll look past Eve's presentation, I am struck by the game's attention to detail in costume design. The variety, while staying within the game's theme, is excellent, and each outfit feels unique. There are certainly those of these that are designed to just change the lens through which you fetishize Eve. There are still others that are more modest and just as well designed. I'm also open to the opinion that these have an old Square Enix problem, where the costumes are potentially over-designed and have detail for the sake of detail. But the attention given to each of them really does come across here. In a gameplay sense, these are presented as valuable rewards for finishing quests, or as the final part of a collectible set. This is better than just being given a handful of crafting parts. There are even more costumes in the game's New Game Plus, which was added along with the Day 1 patch. This is where you start to see palette swaps, but there's more than enough variety that you'll find one that you like for Eve, even if there is some controversy about some of these being censored. Technically speaking, this game is one of the best performing games that I've played on the PlayStation 5 and ran essentially flawlessly. It's certainly not the best looking game I've played, but it's certainly good looking, with costumes and environmental design a strong plus. What was really telling was that I never felt the need to move the game out of its balanced graphics mode. I'm usually after 60 FPS in action-based games, which means I have to sacrifice some image quality or switch to performance mode. This game's balance setting worked really well to maintain a solid frame rate and provide a good visual experience. The mode that prioritizes resolution drops the frame rate a little too much for my liking, but I was quite impressed that at no point did I feel like I needed to put this game into performance mode. Stellar Blade also comes with some nice accessibility options, like auto loot, which I toggled on from the start. I also turned on the easy fishing mode, as while I liked this game's fishing minigame, after an hour of manually doing this, I could feel some aches coming on from the trigger feedback and constantly pressing square. There's also some other nice quality of life things that you don't need to toggle on, such as being able to automatically travel back to a quest giver once you've achieved the objective. Perhaps a strange addition in settings is that you can control the length of Eve's ponytail in the gameplay settings menu. This feels like something that should have been an option at the in-game salon, but it finds its place in the main settings. Finally, I do want to heap some praise on the game's music, which is fairly understated within the game, almost deliberately fading into the background. But there's a good mix of harmony-laden overtures and jazzy tracks in town, along with some that just rock when you're fighting in combat. I do have a few other minor issues, but these are small and easily looked past. I'm referring to things like the weak dying animation that Eve has. It just feels a little low effort. The The game's length, which ran up a 25-hour runtime for a playthrough that I did almost everything in, does feel a little short. And had this game not added New Game Plus on day one, my opinion might be completely different. A note on that though, you do really want to have to see the other endings or challenge the game's hard difficulty for this to have any value for you at all. In conclusion, Stellar Blade comes off quite well, and you can tell that the combat was a real focus for the team at Shift Up. The story is somewhere in the realm of average and gets propped up heavily by the game's lore and world building. I've seen a lot of comparisons that this game has drawn to 2017's Nier Automata, but this certainly lacks the same impact and thought-provoking content that game did, even if in concept they are quite similar. Eve's character design and fanservice dress-up showcase Shift Up's attention to detail, and their ability to work with the Unreal 4 engine, but they aren't important enough in the big picture to meaningfully affect how I feel about this game. Undoubtedly, the best thing about Stellar Blade is the way that it melds atmospheric horror sections into a game that seems originally to have been designed to operate at a much faster pace. This finds a good balance between speed and tension in environments, and success in this endeavour really helps lift this game to a solid recommendation. As long as you're not sick of dystopian Earth as a gameplay setting, or expecting this to be a 70-hour epic, you'll find Stellar Blade to be a good addition to the PS5's growing roster of action games.
Amazing. Gotta admit, you're good.
Really? I didn't think you would say that.